On today's episode, we talk to Big Brother Cappaulli.
He's back. Can you believe it?
We talked about his update, his grief bones, everything there. And
I'm ready for the update, bro.
Update number 2.
Stay tuned.
Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about grief and mourning. Is it argumental or existential? What's it mean to me? Let's talk about death.
Hi, I'm Benny Cappaulli, and I'm a funeral professional.
And I'm Nicholas Cappaulli, a psychologist.
Hey, Nick, let's talk about death.
Let's do it.
Cappaulli, yeah.
It's so funky.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, welcome back, listeners. We have the three brothers here. We
Three
got
brothers.
Doc, Nicholas, Benjamin, or Benny, and Cappaulli.
Sure.
Or Chris, if we call you that, so I apologize.
Either one works.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the update of Cappaulli. He is on his second year of going through his mortuary science. How's it going, Cappaulli?
It's going really well. Going back to school has been really, really interesting challenge, but not to toot my own horn, kind of killing it, doing really well. I got 3 semesters in the bag. First one going back, because I don't know if we've addressed this in a prior episode, but I did a spring and summer semester completely online. And not only was that the first time going back to college in like 15 years, but also I never did online before. So that was really, really different, but I liked it a lot. I kind of like set my own schedule, got to teach myself, had really good professors. The only negative thing I will say about it is it's 8 weeks. So every week, you have a test, you're learning 2 to 3 chapters, you're reading quite a bit, projects. But I ended up getting a B in both classes, which I thought was pretty good considering. And then after spring, summer, I did the first part of anatomy in fall, along with small business and entrepreneurship. A's in both of those bad boys. And then this past semester winter, I just did anatomy part 2. And again, I got an A on that as well. Those classes, the anatomies part 1 and part 2, I did take in person at school. Small business I did online as well. So I've had a little bit of a blended situation for said 3 semesters.
Well, and that's good to talk about, because if you're thinking about going into mortuary science, you're going to have to take a lot of these sciences, specifically anatomy and phys 1 and 2 and biology. So, Chris, out of those classes so far, what was the most challenging in your opinion?
So interestingly enough, the most challenging class that I had was also my most favorite class, which was anatomy part 1 and 2. Absolutely adored my professor. Very, very tough courses, very, very tough, demanding, but he was that type of professor that would stay late to help you. He would quiz us. So like a lot of times when we'd have lab, most of the class would dismiss and leave early. And I had a little cool study group in both semesters. We would stay late with him and, joke around and laugh a little bit, but we would have him quiz us, and we all did really well because of that. But I can tell you that it was, studying every day, hours every day. It was very stressful. I got made fun of a lot because I like perpetually thought that I was failing all the time.
Yeah. So listeners, let me delve into this. So Cappaulli would literally come into the funeral home every day, and he would look like he is failing a class. He'd be so nervous about his test 2 weeks in advance. Every day leading up, I'm going to fail it. I don't know this material. And then we'd say the next day after the test, how'd you do? And he'd be like, oh, I got an A. No big deal.
But here's the thing. In my defense, the amount of information that I had to study was insane. Like, I really don't even understand how I retained the majority of it. It was, he did everything based on PowerPoint slides. So you might have 250 slides that you're studying in a month. And it's, pictures of the body, knowing where all the spots are, knowing where all the landmarks, how do they work? It was like everybody's crammed before for a test, but for me, it felt like I'm cramming 3 tests at the same time.
I'll be honest, out of all those prerequisites, those anatomy and phys are probably the most relevant to what we do. So I'm glad you did that. But let's talk about, another year in the funeral home, another year working under Dad and I, things that you've come across, like, and has school helped you in anything that you've come across in the funeral home? Have you noticed anything? I know you say a lot of anatomy terminology, like most people don't understand what you're talking about, but you're dealing with a lot of anatomy and physiology majors in this funeral home, so we do understand what you're talking about. But you come in and you'll use the scientific terms for anatomy, and it's funny now because you're pretend you're a doctor when it comes to a lot of anatomy and physiology now.
It's exciting, and I get what you're saying, and that's fair. But for me, it's like, because I did well in these classes and I retained the information and I'm starting to be able to connect the dots. It's really cool. It's really cool to be able to have a conversation with somebody and be like, I actually get and understand it now. It makes sense. The skeleton is crazy. The skeleton has 200 plus bones. I learned most of them. I can tell you where they're at. That's really cool. So to be able to, I guess, apply that knowledge in the morgue is going to be great, because there's going to come a time where I'm going to be able to say, this is this is that, blah, blah, blah. These are the pathways and whatnot. So, and you had told me that when I do get to the bachelor program, I'm going to have to take anatomy and physiology again, correct?
That's correct.
So to me, this is great because it's going to be all the stuff I've already gone through, which I've saved all the notes. I have all the tests. When I go back and do the second round of it, I would hope it's going to be a lot easier. And you also told me that usually the second time around is easier. It's more condensed.
It's just rebuilding. It's just rebuilding on it. And then they're going to scope in on the vessels and anatomy that we use on a day-to-day basis as embalmers. So it is relevant. It's nice, and it's also kind of cool to go to a doctor's appointment the next time, and instead of it seems like they're speaking another language, everything that they're talking about.
Yeah, well, and piggybacking off that, not even just anatomy and physiology, but like I said, spring and summer I took medical terminology. So not only did that help in anatomy and anatomy and physiology, because I understood what he was talking about, but I also could speak to it. And it would make sense.
Well, yeah. Now you're helping with the death certificates too. So I bet a lot of the causes of death that you might not have completely understood before, you have an idea of where it is or what the actual
COPD. I see COPD all the time, and now I know and understand what it is.
And it's a lot of Latin too. You're using a lot of suffixes and prefixes for terminology. So that's really cool, and I think it definitely will help you. How is your home life with that? How is school with working and also trying to juggle, kids and awesome brothers that live next to you? How does that come across for you?
Spring and summer was really difficult. Spring and summer, I didn't feel like I had much of a life, which again, 8-week program versus a 12-week program. It makes sense because it's elevated, escalated, and sped up. But I would say by the time I got to fall and winter, I had a better balance, really trying to focus on when I have the kids, not worrying so much about schoolwork, wait until they're in bed, or times of the day when they're invested or involved in something else. That would be, pull up a laptop and study a little bit. But all in all, I think it's pretty smooth. And the funeral home's been ultra accommodating too with my school schedule and helping out with all that. So that's been a blessing too. Plus he brought up, the awesome, cool brothers or whatever he was saying, praising himself. They have been great. Hold on. They have been great about helping out with watching the kids too, stepping in if they know that I got a big test coming up, or if I'm stressing out about a project. They're really good about hey, let me take the kids for a few hours, or, hey, go in the house and study a little bit. We'll watch them outside, let them play while you're doing your thing. And I really appreciate that. That does mean the world to me.
Wait a minute. We're talking about Ben's ego?
It has to be stroked. It has to be stroked frequently. That's just...
Woo. Bring in the harp strings. A little stroke there, baby.
That didn't make any sense.
Here we
that
go.
Made zero,
There we go.
Zero sense.
No, and I think it's really cool going back into your college. I think it's a really smart idea that you took the summer off to kind of recollect yourself for another year. You got probably one more year of prereqs, and then you're heading out to Wayne is the goal, right?
Yes, and that's a good point, because I did 3 semesters back to back. I did take a break this spring and summer, mainly because, like I had said, I felt like I didn't have a life, and spending time with my family, specifically my kids, it's too important to me. So it was like, I don't want to trade that. I don't want to trade that time, especially with how young my kids are. Like, I don't get them this age that long, so I need to take advantage of that. That being said, yeah, so fall and then winter should be the rest of my prereqs. I still got to do chemistry, which I'm terrified. I'm
Yum.
terrified.
Yum.
Oh, the
Throw a
periodic
little
table.
math in there.
Yeah.
Periodic
Yum,
table.
baby.
Let's balance out those ridiculous
Yeah,
equations
you'll
that I
have
don't want to
some
look at.
inorganic and some organic chemistry you're going to have to do, and then you probably have like a
I have
microbiology.
microbiology, yep. And then, ironically enough, the third one, if I'm not mistaken, is philosophy.
Okay,
I took philosophy of religion years ago.
doesn't count,
They
baby.
didn't count it. They didn't count it, and I did well in that. If I remember correctly, I got a B in that class as well, and that was back when I was still like early 20s, like late teens, early 20s. They don't count that, so I got to take like a normal, legit philosophy class too. But once those are done, then the idea would be that following fall, we'll be starting the bachelor program, the 2-year program at Wayne State. That's the plan. That's the plan.
That's awesome, and we've talked about too starting your apprentice work, like the actual state apprenticeship, which in the state of Michigan, if you already have your degree, it's a 6-month apprenticeship. If you do not have your degree, as in bachelor's of science through mortuary science, then it's a year apprenticeship. So you will be doing your apprenticeship while you're doing your prereq. So when you get to Wayne State, you'll have a great understanding of not only embalming, but the actual process of funeral directing at that point, which is, I'm really excited for you. So the next time you guys listen into an update, hopefully Chris has gone through, or Cappaulli has gone through a lot of the apprenticeship, which would be super cool to hear from. Because I know a lot of listeners say they want to hear more about the schooling and educating on being a funeral director, because people just don't have any idea how much schooling goes into being a funeral director, / embalmer in the state of Michigan. So that's, yeah. And I think Doc and I have talked about boundaries. So I think it's very appropriate that you know that you kind of have to take a little reset here for the summer. I know a lot of funeral directors, young ones, will say to me, for the summer before I go into a funeral home, should I do certain things? Or there was a story that Dad helped one of the local funeral directors go to work at Cedar Point for the summer before his funeral directing. It's important because once we get fully into it, it's kind of, you're kind of married to this post in a strange way. So I think it's very, very good for boundaries to be set, and I think that's appropriate, Chris. And so, Cappaulli, I'm really excited for the future for you. Anything you've noticed in the funeral home working with Dad and I this year that has caught you, maybe something you've learned or something you've taken outside of schooling?
Not particularly anything I can think of off the top of my head. Like I said, I am identifying things and understanding things better than I did prior to taking these classes, specifically anatomy. So that is cool to be able to make those connections. But other than that, kind of feels like business as usual.
Well, one thing to the listeners out there, Chris Cappaulli is not only learning to become a funeral director, but he's also learning the business aspect. So he is working with our financial director and all that stuff. So I think Chris gets a lot of insight on the financial part of the funeral home, which can be scary depending on, what the caseload is, or, we just kind of went through a slow down section,
A lull,
which I think the financial part of the funeral home gets a little nerve wracking, trying to make sure that everybody, all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. So in that aspect, because I know, not saying that Benny doesn't really know a lot of that, but let's be real, Benny doesn't know a lot of that. What have you noticed on that aspect of the job?
I mean, you said it best. During a lull, it's scary because regardless of our business, bills have to still be paid, payroll has to still be paid. Things don't slow down in the office because our business slows down. It's more a question of, do we need to look into getting a loan, or do we need to cut back a little bit on this, that, and the other? Just you obviously you pinch pennies when time is slow and business is slow. And you guys have talked about this in prior episodes too. This is not a consistent business. Like, we don't have any control over when people pass away. It happens when it happens, and then we're there to help when it's time to help. Looking at it from a financial standpoint is completely different than looking at it from I'm sitting with families and talking to them and going through the grief process, because there's also that flip flop of, we got to keep the doors open. We got to keep the lights on. And that's an extra level of stress and anxiety that not everybody does see and experience, because they're not in the office. Usually there's a front of house and the back of house, right? It's any industry, any profession. Like he said, I'm kind of the bridge. Dr. Nick had said, like, I'm kind of the bridge between both. So I'm front of house with, Dad and Benny. I'm meeting the families, going on death calls, sitting in on arrangements, this, that, and the other. But then I'm also working with my mom in the office, and we're, balancing checkbooks, and we're sending stuff to our corporate company to look over numbers and statements and accounts and stuff. So,
and price changes and all
price
that stuff.
changes, sure, all sorts of
so
stuff.
much.
All
Well, and
sorts of
I think this is kind of an important topic, because I think a lot of the listeners out there that aren't, haven't been born, bred, and raised in the funeral home, profession, don't know the, that back end part of it, right? Like, what are they actually doing on a day-to-day basis? You see the funeral professional in the suit and, standing in the corner or parking the cars or riding the hearse, but you don't really get to see them when, the stack of, papers are yay high on the desk, and you're trying to sort through them, try to figure that out. And then on top of it, you got a death call, and you have to kind of like stop in the middle of what you're doing, go do that. Yeah. I just feel like a lot of people don't know that side of this profession. So that's kind of why I think it would be great, as we continue with your updates, if we're calling them that, you kind of talk more about that side of it. Cause I think Ben kills it with the profession, the funeral profession part of it, the directing part of it, but we don't talk about the office stuff very often.
Well, and we've said this before. They took a median, or whatever you want to call it, of how many hours it takes to do a traditional call, and it was like 64 hours go into one case. So, and that's going through everything. That's going through the pickup, to the embalming, to the meeting the family, to the arrangements, to all the
sending out medical certificates, waiting on the death certificate,
the financial reports,
certified,
the embalming reports, every reports, because that's another thing too. People don't realize how stipulated, especially Michigan funeral directors are, with the FTC and with all of these extra things that the state wants to make sure that we are up on everything, which is wonderful. Don't get me wrong, but it adds a lot of stress on a inconsistent time of a job that we just don't know what our time we have and what we're going to be spending our day doing. So I do agree with you, Doc, that it's important for people to understand that this job has a lot to it.
One more thing. I think it's also important for the listeners out there to understand, when you come in and you meet with the funeral director after a death, and you ask, like, why can't we do this like tomorrow? Right? Is like, there's just so much to the process that I'm going to say 95% of people don't know, just because they're ignorant in this field. So to explain kind of the process and what that looks like and what you two go through on a day-to-day basis, I think is really important, because I think it normalizes that there's a job going on here too.
Well, that's awesome that you brought that up, because no joke, I had a conversation with Dad about this, with them going on vacation. The idea being that when we get a death call and we go on the removal or the pickup or whatever you want to call it, that kind of like kickstarts everything. But from that point on, there are so many things that we have to do to prepare for the visitation, the funeral, the memorial service, whatever you're doing, graveside. There's a ton of paperwork. There's a ton of like things that we have to do to prepare and get ready, setting up the chapel, reaching out to the clergy. So yes, you can't get everything done in one night. You can't get everything done in one day. Usually, when we do the pickup, the next day we're meeting with the family. Then we need a day after that, usually, to just get all the paperwork together and out. We have a client file that we do. I said earlier in this episode about, we have a medical certificate that we have to have signed from the doctor. We have the death certificate that needs to be certified. We have to order it. There's just so much. And that typically all has to either be done or in the process of being done while we're setting up for the actual arrangement. And so it's like a wedding planner, right? It's not just about the wedding. They got to get a DJ, they got to get catering, they got to do this, they got to do that. We're kind of in a way like that, sort of, not really, but kind of.
Yeah,
There's just
well,
so much.
I mean, we've talked about this before. A wedding planner has a whole year usually, or at least 6 months to put a wedding together. We have 3 days. And then the other thing too to bring to that is people are under the illusion that direct cremation is a very fast process, and that actually takes a lot more paperwork because it's so finite. So people are under the impression because I say it's a direct cremation, I want my cremains, I want my loved one back tomorrow or the next day. It doesn't work like that, because we're also working with doctors, we're working with medical examiners. If it's the weekend,
Newspapers,
obituaries,
medical examiners, and they're not working on Saturdays and Sundays, so you're not getting the cremation permit if that's the case, if it falls on the weekend. There's a lot that go into it, and it at times it gets overwhelming explaining. And that was something I was going to ask you, Cappaulli, before we get into the Q&A. How is your grief tank? Like, how is your anxiety, grief, secondhand grief? How's that all adding up right now? Are you still pretty comfortable with the job?
Yeah.
Did you say the grief tank?
The grief bone.
Do you like it? Grief tank?
No, I like self-care tank.
Okay. Well, I like grief tank in our,
because he's not really grieving right now. Well,
Grief
I guess
Busters!
in a way he is grieving not being a funeral
Proton
director.
pack.
When you're walking down the street and you see a little ghost,
Grief
tell me what you're gonna
Busters!
do about grief
Yeah,
busters.
so I like the grief tanks.
So we'll use it. It just hurts my soul a little bit.
Grief bone. You got hit right in the grief bone. Right in the grief bone. That's a good Office reference. Honestly, my levels of anxiety are not terrible as far as the actual job is concerned. School, college terrifies me. I was not a good student in grade school and high school. I did not like the first round of college, partially though I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and I felt like I was wasting a lot of time. Going back, I mean, I'm dedicated. I'm focused. I want to do this. I put a lot of effort into it, probably more effort into this than most, hobbies, endeavors, most things that I'm involved in, because it's so important to me. I noticed going back as an adult, it is completely different than when I went as, a late teenager, early 20s student. So a lot of my stress and anxiety come from college. And it's just because I'm hard on myself because I want to do well. I'm pushing myself because I want to do well. It's not enough to just eke by and get C's. You've heard the C's get degrees. That's great. That's fine. But if I'm going to do this, I want to do it right. I want to actually make the most out of it. I want to earn my keep, so to speak. So that being said, I'm my own worst enemy, and I'm very hard on myself. And that's why when I walk out of an exam and I've gotten an A, I don't feel like I got an A. I walk out like, I just bombed that. I did terrible. I literally, until I get that test back, I didn't do enough. I didn't study enough. And it's like, I'll tell my brothers, I'll tell my fiance, I'll tell whoever. And they're like, dude, you're studying all the time. You're what more can you do? And I'm like, I know, but it just never feels enough. So that's something I got to work on. And I'm hoping by the time I get in the bachelor program that a lot of that initial scary college jitters are out of the way. But that's been tough. That's been tough for me. That's where a lot of my stress and anxiety is coming from, is schooling.
How about the family dynamics now being another year into the system?
It feels the same. I don't notice a whole lot of difference. Like I said, the one thing that I value and cherish is you guys being so accommodating with not only my school schedule, but helping with the kids. That's tremendous for me. And they're great about, making sure I have time to be with my kids when I have my kids. So it's that I really appreciate. And yeah, we have our squabbles, and yeah, we have times where we get annoyed with each other. That's unfortunately a small business. That's any small business. And actually we're blessed because it's even worse for most small businesses. So we don't have anything really terrible or scary or anything like that. But I think too, we talked about the lull that just happened. I think that also adds stress too. When we're slow, we're a little more stressed out. And I think that brings out a little bit of bickering, but also I wanted to point out too, with that lull, one of the positive things about that lull and talking to my dad, that did give us time to get some deep cleaning done. We have renovated the main office, which is really, really cool. Doc Nick's wife did a phenomenal job painting and resurfacing and doing all. I mean, it looks phenomenal. We're literally in the process of upgrading the building again, just kind of one piece at a time. But also the landscaping outside. We don't have a landscaping service that does our day to day. We have plenty of able-bodied people that can mow and edge, and so I mean we really took advantage of that lull to get a lot of stuff done, and the building's looking great. And the hope is that as people come, they see some of the changes, and it wasn't a waste, even though we were slow. Is I guess what I'm trying to say. That was the main point of that.
Well, guys, brothers, I think it's time
for the Q&A.
Q&A, everyone loves that Q&A.
Q&A time, baby. Woo! It's a Q&A and Q&A and A and Q and Q&A, baby.
Questions and answers.
All right, Cappaulli, we're going to let you answer this one first, or you want to go last?
Hit me.
Hit you up. Okay, here we go. Triggers with death. The topic of death has a lot of big triggers in my system and my history. I have complex PTSD, but I am struggling with how I may be able to call a friend who lost her husband at age 40. Seeking any thoughts?
40 is too young. PTSD is tough because I don't know a lot about it, and I'm not gonna try to navigate around that. I can't even imagine what PTSD. Yeah, this is more of a Doc Nick.
No, go ahead.
Question.
Finish
But what I would say is maybe kind of pre-plan what you want to say. Maybe for me, I like using bullet points. If it were me, and like I said, I don't understand your situation completely. I'm just reading a paragraph here, but my thing would be if that were me, I would 100% want to do it, because you never know if you're going to get an opportunity to do that again. And not to mention, obviously you want to be there for this person, or you wouldn't be asking us. What I would do is maybe not necessarily rehearse the conversation, but at least have bullet points that if you get stuck or you don't know what to say, you have something to reference. They're not going to see it on the other end of the phone unless you're FaceTiming. And even that, I would think they would still appreciate and respect the fact that you're trying to do something. But anything you say is going to be tough. I mean, it's 40. 40 is really young. That's scary. I'm going to be 40 next year. That's terrifying. So I would just say, just maybe have somewhat of a plan. Talk to family, talk to friends, maybe get some advice. You don't have to do it alone too. I mean, it could be if you want to reach out with a couple other people. I think the options are limitless. But I would say maybe just have some bullet point things to say so you don't get stuck. That would be what I would say, maybe.
For me, I'm more let's be in the moment. Let's be real. Let's not have a lot of, preparation. Just I want to go with the heart, right? I want to tell you how I feel. But I think there's so many facets to this question, because I get trying to answer it in how are you going to help this person? How are you going to help the person that just lost their husband? But my question as the therapist would be, how are you going to navigate your PTSD talking about this? Because I would imagine that if you're bringing the complex PTSD up for this situation, I would imagine that some of your PTSD has to do with grief or death. So my thing is that first things first, I would make sure that the person that was about to call this friend to be super grounded, level-headed, in a good spot, in a good place, maybe even meditated or yogaed before that conversation. Get to a place where you feel comfortable to be present. Not because I think a lot of unfortunate, one of the byproducts to PTSD, if you will, is being disassociated. So if you're calling this person and being triggered and you get to the part where you're disassociated, you're not really being present with that person. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I think you're protecting yourself. But for that person that just lost, probably the love of their life, what they really need is people to be present, people to really be there to understand and take a seat with them and hold their hand. And, so I guess what I would say to this person is, again, make sure you're in a good spot, make sure you're in a good place, and then reach out to the friend.
Yeah, and I mean, you two nailed it. So I'm just going to make my little suggestion, and this listener, if one ear and out the other if you don't like it. Maybe another suggestion would be just to address that you're struggling too. Just, call the person, say, hey, before I get started, I know you're in a tough place right now, but I'm going to be honest, this is really tough for me to talk about. And humanize your PTSD and bring it out to the front.
And lastly, I think Ben nailed it there, because there's a universality when it comes to grief and loss and in dealing with death. So something that's so lonely and so isolating, like dealing with the death of a loved one, being that person that kind of walks in the system and says, hey, I'm struggling too. Let's walk this path together, if you will.
It might be a breath of fresh air for that person, because especially grievers tend to, and not all of them, but tend to like to be in the presence of other grievers. It's a safe place.
It's a community.
It's a community. Absolutely.
That's why groups work, right?
That's why they work.
All right, we're going to close this bad boy up. So thank you for listening. And as always, email us with your thoughts and questions. Let's talk about deathpod@gmail.com. Please share with your friends to help spread the word about our mission to get people talking about death. And if you like us, please, please, please give us 5 stars and leave a review.
Review.
Reviews are very important and greatly appreciated. Please, feedback is amazing. Because if you're not talking about death,
then you're not living. Thank you so much.